Just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Katrina Martin and I'm the Asia Pacific Pro Bono Director at DLA Piper. The session today is looking at the role in which lawyers can play in supporting the emerging framework in business and human rights. And I'm delighted to introduce the esteemed panel with me to discuss that issue today. We have Bobby Star-Maria from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre in Myanmar, Jessica Marsh from Trust Law in Thailand, Andy Mutakin from ESLAM, which is the ELSAM, just so I get this right, the Institute for Policy, Research and Advocacy, based in Jakarta, and also Anthony Crockett from Herbert Smith Freehills, one of the senior associates in their Indonesian office there. So 5 years ago, the UN unanimously, the Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Those principles, there were 31 of them, and they set out clearly the role of states to protect, businesses to respect, and the rights of a victim to access a remedy where there has been a breach of their human rights. So to start the panel discussion, I'd like each of you to just talk a little bit about what the developments have been in each of your countries in the business and human rights framework, given that we here are 5 years on from those guiding principles being first endorsed.
Hi, I wanted to speak more about Southeast Asia in general because it's my the coverage of my area of work. I want to point out a few changes that we've observed among business, among governments, and among different stakeholders 5 years after the endorsement of the UN Guiding Principles. So what has changed in business? We have observed that there are actually more companies now that are developing their human rights policy statements, meaning more companies positively stating that they respect human rights. And we have also observed a rise in the number of companies conducting human rights due diligence or impact assessments, and some leading companies are actually integrating these human rights impact assessments into their operations and just not a separate part of a certain department. And all of these are exactly what the guiding principles describe as the responsibility of business to respect human rights. We have also observed that human rights are starting to shape investment decisions more and more, and also consumer decisions to a certain extent. And among business, we have noticed a general increase in engagement on human rights. Whereas before, it's easy, for example, for the smaller, less known companies to just ignore public allegations of human rights abuses. These days, we see more and more of these kinds of companies actually responding. I just wanted to breeze through like a few more changes that we've observed for governments. There are a number of governments developing national action plans, which is like the strategy that they choose to undertake in implementing the guiding principles, and there are also positive steps in requiring impact assessments and reporting, and actually some binding measures that have the impact of protecting rights, even rights of those outside their jurisdictions. Just to name a few examples, the UK Modern Slavery Act or the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act. And among stakeholders outside of governments and businesses, we have also observed a heightened expectation among stakeholders for companies to respect human rights. Companies are being subject to more sophisticated forms of public scrutiny in terms of their human rights behavior, and not just the ones that are directly involved in, but also the ones that are linked to them through their supply chains and etc. We've also noticed a diversity and engagement. So we see a healthy mix of naming and shaming, which was the more common form of advocacy and campaigning before, and a lot of constructive engagement as well that are not necessarily known to the public, and also the use of law. There are a lot of interesting transnational cases, for example, that are being brought. The most recent of which is that we've monitored is the case involving Indonesian seaweed fishers that brought a case in Australia for damage caused by an oil spill, or Cambodian human trafficking survivors that brought a case in the United States under the for abuses in the workplace. So those are a few of the changes, but we have also observed that there are things that have not changed enough. We could say that concrete policies have improved, due diligence practices have improved, but concrete action among companies are generally still lacking, and many companies are still really being driven by legal requirements to act, and not just these voluntary guidelines.
Thanks. I'm based in Bangkok with Trust Law, and a few concrete, I guess, recent developments. There was, in April 2016, the first Asia Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights in Doha. From that, Thailand's representative to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights raised discussion about a regional action plan, so development of a regional action plan. There are probably people in this room that may be better qualified to update exactly what's happening there, if there is anything happening. But that was in April 2016. In May 2016, the Global Compact Network Thailand was formed. So that's a network working to strengthen responsible business in Thailand. To date, there are around 68 companies in Thailand that have joined the UN Global Compact. So there are recent concrete steps forward, although a long way to go. In terms of business action on human rights issues, we're seeing more close relationships in some instances with civil society. For example, Thai Union, which is a very big seafood company, is working closely with the Migrant Workers' Rights Network to improve labour conditions in their factories in Thailand. That's a relatively newer type of engagement because of how closely they're working together. Granted, I think some of the action was spurred on by criticisms from other parts of civil society. Greenpeace is one critic. So, civil society is still, obviously there's the naming and shaming, but other collaborative efforts to work together to improve conditions.
Great, thanks Jess. Anthony and Andy, both of you based in Indonesia, what perhaps have been some of the most recent developments and really positive movements for your country?
Please allow me speak in bahasa. Jadi memang pasca 2011 disahkannya UNGPs ini cukup banyak perubahan atau hal yang positif yang telah diambil prinsip-prinsip hak asasi manusia yang ada di UNGP ke dalam aturan-aturan baik internasional maupun di nasional. Saya akan berbicara sedikit misalnya panduan OECD bagi multinational enterprises. Pada 2011 dia sudah merevisi dan memasukkan chapter hak asasi manusia di dalam panduan tersebut. Kemudian juga RSPO, Roundtable Sustainable on Palm Oil, itu bahkan sampai membentuk Human Rights Working Group itu untuk mengadopsi atau memperbarui prinsip dan kriteria yang mereka gunakan. Nah, beberapa respon Indonesia waktu itu memang di Dewan HAM PBB pada 2011 terkait bisnis dan hak asasi manusia, perwakilan Indonesia bahkan menyatakan dia akan segera mempercepat adanya kerangka hukum yang mengatur tentang bisnis dan hak asasi manusia di Indonesia. Mereka juga akan mempertimbangkan untuk mengintegrasikan prinsip-prinsip tersebut di dalam aturan-aturan nasionalnya. Tapi dari 2011 sampai sekarang 2016, apa yang dimandatkan oleh Human Rights Working Group untuk bisnis dan HAM ini dari PBB itu adalah National Action Plan, itu belum juga selesai. National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Nah, inisiatif-inisiatif yang muncul di pemerintah Indonesia itu ada beberapa inisiatif. Bisa saya sebutkan misalnya di Kementerian Perindustrian itu memiliki aturan tentang komite pengarah dan tim teknis penyelenggaraan kegiatan HAM di bidang industri. Jadi masih dalam satu kementerian. Kemudian di kementerian lain itu juga memiliki peraturan Menteri Kelautan tentang sistem dan sertifikasi HAM bagi badan usaha perikanan. Jadi badan-badan usaha perikanan itu nanti ke depan akan disertifikasi oleh kementerian. Sertifikasi hak asasi manusia. Nah, sedangkan yang menyeluruh itu di Indonesia belum memilikinya. National Action Plan yang harusnya sudah digenjot sampai saat ini, Komnas HAM itu baru membuat draftnya. Komnas HAM Indonesia, kita juga, Elsam juga berkontribusi dalam penyusunan itu. Ada hal yang memang cukup mengganjal, ada tantangan yang harus dijawab ke depan untuk penyusunan National Action Plan ini. Karena ternyata di Kementerian Hukum dan HAM, kemudian di Kementerian Luar Negeri itu masih berbeda pendapat soal siapa yang akan kemudian mengambil peran memimpin untuk penyusunan ini. Jadi karena dua kementerian yang kita pikir itu paling cocok untuk mengerjakan NAP ini, karena mereka belum setuju soal siapa yang mengerjakan, akhirnya Komnas HAM mengerjakan substansinya untuk sementara. Jadi September, Oktober ke depan kita, Komnas HAM itu akan bikin forum, high panel meeting antar kementerian di Indonesia untuk merumuskan bagaimana sebaiknya National Action Plan ini dibuat di Indonesia. Itu soal National Action Plan. Kemudian di Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, jadi ada badan di Indonesia yang mengawasi soal perbankan, keuangan. Dari roadmap-nya soal sustainability finance, dia akan mengeluarkan peraturan OJK, peraturan Otoritas Jasa Keuangan tentang bagaimana sustainability finance itu akan dilakukan. Nah, prinsip-prinsip HAM ini itu akan diintegrasikan dalam satu chapter tentang sosial. Nah, terakhir yang bisa saya sampaikan mungkin soal di sisi korporasi cukup banyak responnya dari korporasi. Korporasi-korporasi yang besar di Indonesia itu khususnya saat ini sudah banyak melakukan human rights due diligence, kemudian mereka membuat aturan internal tentang hak asasi manusia, dan bahkan sampai ada beberapa yang itu sudah memiliki mekanisme pemulihan internalnya, sebagaimana yang diatur dalam pilar 3 di Ragi Principle. Di unit bisnis itu juga sudah membentuk IGCN, satu kelompok bisnis yang saya pikir bisa menjadikan acuan, Indonesia Global Compact Network. Mereka membentuk yang namanya Human Rights Working Group Business and Human Rights. Jadi keanggotaannya itu membernya IGCN, member Global Compact di Indonesia, dan non IGCN. Jadi perusahaan-perusahaan, CSO dan juga akademisi itu membentuk forum ini. Mungkin itu dulu yang pengantarnya. Terima kasih.
Thanks. I think we've had a quite comprehensive sort of coverage of the different examples of how business and human rights is becoming something very mainstream in Southeast Asia. And I guess all I would add, Andy mentioned, for example, the Indonesian financial services regulator getting involved in thinking about business and human rights issues. And you know, that's an example of, as I say, mainstreaming of business and human rights as a corporate governance issue and as something that increasingly is on the radar of regulators, on the radar of boardrooms, on the radar of general counsel in major corporations. And I think I just mentioned two other developments in the region in which I see in Indonesia, which are very important, particularly in terms of the discussion amongst lawyers. One is that one of the things John Ruggie emphasised in the guiding principles, due diligence, having a policy, but also transparency from companies about the things they're doing to ensure respect for human rights and to ensure that they're conducting their businesses in a responsible way. And what John Ruggie said about reporting was sort of trying to say to companies, you can't just tell us the good stuff. You can't just publish glossy CSR reports, blue wash, telling us about the primary school you've built or the hospital you've funded. You have to tell us what are you doing proactively to avoid negative impacts. And companies are now doing that, and in many places that's no longer optional. So the Companies Act in the United Kingdom was amended in 2014 to make it an obligation on listed companies to report on human rights. There's similar rules coming into effect in the EU. And I was practicing in London at the time, and there's John Ruggie used to talk about business and human rights as not being a law-free zone, and increasingly it's an area where there's lots of law. So the Singapore Stock Exchange has recently introduced a sustainability reporting requirement, which includes elements that will force companies to report on human rights issues in their supply chains, in their operations. Malaysia is looking at amendments to the Companies Act similar to the amendments in the United Kingdom. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange has a requirement for extractive companies. The Thailand Stock Exchange has a reporting requirement. So that reporting requirements are something where you start to see, and you can look and you can read companies' reports and you can read about the things they are doing to ensure that their operations are not having a negative impact. And in some cases you'll read about the challenges that they're encountering in terms of the issues they face with governments in difficult parts of the world. So that's something that's very interesting. It's no longer a phenomenon confined to Western Europe. It's something that's firmly coming to Asia. And in some ways, some of the developed jurisdictions of Asia Pacific, Australia is a little bit further behind. It's almost like the ripples in the pond. The global principles were adopted in Geneva and the message hasn't quite got to Canberra yet. But there's signs that that's starting to slowly change. And obviously important for this region where there are lots of Australian businesses involved in sectors with significant human rights risks and potential adverse impact. And the one other thing I wanted to mention, and it's another, I suppose, vector by which the guiding principles and international human rights standards become a routine part of business operations, is that Bobby mentioned the number of companies that are increasingly adopting human rights policies, and Andy's referred to that, and the internal processes and the due diligence that companies are doing. The other thing that corporations are increasingly doing, taking their policy and their standards and imposing that down their supply chain, imposing it on joint venture partners through contracts. So the standards become enforceable through the mechanism of the contract. And that includes, in many cases in Southeast Asia, where there are lots of economies, Indonesia, for example, heavily dominated by the state. So the largest companies in Indonesia are state-owned enterprises. And companies with human rights policies coming into joint ventures with these companies and saying, here are our standards on human rights, these are our expectations on human rights, and we're going to reflect these in the contract, in enforceable standards in contracts. And that's a very interesting development, and it creates interesting opportunities for addressing what John Ruggie calls the third pillar of the guiding principles, which is the issue of access to remedy. And remedy isn't just about awarding compensation to somebody at the end of a civil lawsuit, it's about addressing the adverse impact. And so in the scenario where a multinational corporation is in a joint venture with a government, addressing the impact may involve a dialogue between that company and the government about how domestic legal standards need to change, how the enforcement of domestic regulations needs to change to ensure respect and protection for human rights. And so that, I think, is something that is going to be a very interesting development for this region as those contractual provisions start to get tested and we start to see disputes and people being quite creative about what they're trying to do via the mechanism of a contract.
Thanks, Anthony. So you've clearly identified some steps that corporations are taking to really embed, the guiding principles into their own practices. We are here as a, group of lawyers. What really should firms be doing to make sure that they, have a human rights policy, that they're embedding this framework into their own policies and practices as part of their day-to-day operations?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the UN Guiding Principles, if there's probably virtually no one in the room who is not familiar with the Guiding Principles, but important, they say that business enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights, to respect internationally recognised human rights. And law firms are business enterprises. No question about that. So the responsibility to respect human rights applies just as much to a law firm as it applies to British Petroleum or Barclays Bank. Now, what does that mean? Bobby mentioned companies adopting human rights policies, having internal processes. What the guiding principles say in terms of what a business needs to do to respect human rights is that you need to understand as a business what are the potential adverse impacts of your business activities on human rights? How can those adverse impacts be avoided? If they can't be avoided, you have to make a decision about whether you stop doing business or whether you mitigate those impacts in some way. So you have to positively address your mind to how those impacts can be avoided. And what it requires is doing impact assessments and then engaging in a dialogue with the third parties that you may be doing business with and trying to get to a point where you're confident that your activities, your business operations are not having adverse impacts. So what do lawyers do in a firm as a business? We provide advice. And there is a potential that the advice lawyers provide to their clients, to their corporate clients, can contribute, arguably can cause adverse impacts on human rights. And so law firms now starting to look at this and think, well, what do we need to do as a law firm to ensure that in the provision of legal services that we are meeting the responsibility to respect human rights. And that, very similar to a large corporation, you will see law firms adopting human rights policies, implementing internal due diligence processes, and in many cases that will be things like making sure that suppliers and contractors to the law firm are respecting human rights. So are cleaners who clean the lawyers' offices paid a minimum wage? What are their working conditions like? Are the paper suppliers that are supplying the stationery, are their supply chains sustainable? All of those things that in the corporate world have been a routine part of sustainability and corporate responsibility for a long time. And law firms have some catching up to do. Law firms are conservative places. I was working with another large international law firm in London for many years. When I joined, it was the largest international law firm in the world. And in 2011, after the UN Guiding Principles had been adopted, and we'd done a lot of work with John Ruggie pro bono, and we'd been providing John Ruggie with all sorts of advice about international law and business law that was relevant to his mandate and the recommendations he ultimately made as the special representative. But then people started to say, well, hang on a minute, we're a business enterprise, what will this mean for the firm? And one of the things we did was we looked at our clients, and 80% of our top 20 global clients had human rights policies. And a significant majority, almost 60% of our top 100 clients globally had human rights policies. And so law firms were really in the position of having to catch up to their clients. This wasn't a thing where law firms were leading by example. We were actually behind the eight ball. The other thing that we found was that clients were starting to ask the law firm, do you have a human rights policy? Do you have standards for ensuring that your suppliers and subcontractors are treated well? And ironically, are you looking after your lawyers? So I had an experience where my firm was pitching to get on the panel of a major international oil and gas company. We received a detailed questionnaire about working conditions, the hours people were working, whether people were taking their holidays, whether people were required to reply to emails after a certain hour at night. And we were not successful in that pitch. And when we asked for some feedback about why we weren't successful, one of the things that was said to us was, you don't have a human rights policy and we're not sure that you're looking after your people and their rights. The human right to adequate rest and leisure, for example, we make a joke about it every time there's a discussion about law firms and human rights. So, as I say, law firms are in catch-up mode, but there are a number of law firms globally that now have public human rights policies that are looking at their supply chains, their relationships with third parties. And then the other area where firms are having to think carefully about their activities are the relationship with clients. And I've mentioned this large group of clients who increasingly have human rights policies. They're doing what the UN guiding principles say they should do. And so there's an important role for lawyers in helping companies understand what are international human rights standards, what are the relevant domestic laws, where are the gaps between domestic law and international standards. But also, more proactively, does the law firm have a responsibility to say to the client, have you thought about the human rights impacts of this new mine you're going to build? Or this railway, or your purchase of raw materials from this supplier in this emerging market? And that's quite a difficult question. And we won't have time to get to the bottom of it, but it's something that lots of firms are thinking very carefully about. And at the end of the day, in my experience, has been that it's no good telling lawyers in a law firm, you must think about human rights in the course of your work as a capital markets lawyer or a corporate lawyer or a litigation lawyer, if they don't know anything about human rights. So we've just done a survey with Legal 500 about the awareness of the UN Guiding Principles amongst in-house counsel, and it's actually very impressive. In-house lawyers have heard of them, but if I go and ask colleagues in my firm and in other firms, do you know anything about the UN Guiding Principles? A lot of them have never heard of them. And it's not because people are not interested, it's just because it's not brought to their attention. So when I was at law school, I didn't study any human rights academically. And then in Australia and the UK, you do vocational legal education before you qualify as a lawyer. There was no human rights taught. When you join a major law firm, they don't tell you anything about how human rights is relevant to your... But that's something that's changing, and so law firms are starting to do training on human rights for capital markets lawyers and for intellectual property lawyers. And as you raise people's awareness, lawyers have the ability to spot an issue and say to the client, have you thought about this? Have you thought about the human rights issue? And I think that's the expectation of lawyers these days, of clients. It's that you proactively bring risks to the client's attention. You don't just sit in your office waiting for the phone to ring and the question to be asked. So it's something that I think we're all finding ways to achieve that and to do it effectively. Because the other thing is, lawyers work very hard. You want to drag a lawyer away from their desk and the work they're doing to try and force them to sit down and do a whole lot of training on human rights. And that's something that law firms consider very carefully about ongoing legal education. And I remember looking at the question of, if you're going to give human rights training to lawyers, how do you do it effectively? And there was the talk about the cartoons. It's the same in a law firm. We're all clever people with law degrees, but limited attention spans. And the sort of educational psychologists will tell you that the attention span of a lawyer sitting at their desk doing some online training is about 27 minutes. So if you can't communicate everything you need to tell them about the UN Guiding Principles and about business and human rights in 27 minutes, that's too late. And so that challenge of trying to think, what are the essential messages? As I say, what does a capital markets lawyer need to know? That's slightly different to what an oil and gas lawyer may need to know, and that's a big challenge.
I think you raise a really interesting point around training. The way in which DLA Piper's tried to embed business and human rights framework into our own operations. We have a human rights policy that was approved by the board in 2014. It's just recently been updated with reference to the Modern Slavery Act. We've also now got a dedicated business and human rights associate working in our London office just to really support our fee earners, and this is a fee earning role, recognising that all our clients are so different and the human rights impacts that they face are so diverse. They're working across various geographies. It's a really specialised skill and we need to have that internal expertise, so we've appointed someone for that very purpose. In terms of training, that's something we're also starting to roll out. We're actually making it mandatory. And it's a requirement in order to, progress in your career at DLA Piper. It's as part of the kind of graduate management academies. For that very reason, that it is critical that our lawyers are able to advise our clients on these types of issues. And as you say, it's no longer okay that our clients are coming to us and they actually know more about it than we do. We need to be leading the dialogue with our clients on these types of issues. I guess that then leads into the role of pro bono in upskilling some of our lawyers in this space, and certainly the IBA in their recent guidelines released earlier this year recognised that pro bono is a very valid way in which law firms can use those projects to provide our lawyers with expertise so they can be better human rights lawyers and provide more responsible advice to our clients. Jess, in your role at Trust Law as a clearinghouse, what are the trends that you've seen in the new requests that are either coming in from NGOs, but also the flip side, the types of opportunities that lawyers and firms are now seeking out?
Sure. So I think that the inward-looking obligations now of law firms trying to catch up and make sure that they're complying with business and human rights principles is a real opportunity for pro bono. So we're seeing probably, as there's more awareness within a firm, then probably more openness to doing pro bono in this area. And that could take a range of forms. It could be working specifically with NGOs, organisations who are working already in business and human rights. It could be working so for example, recently we've had a number of requests coming in through the Trust Law Global Pro Bono Clearinghouse from international NGOs who are interested in their own compliance, so INGOs who are concerned about how the UK Modern Slavery Act applies to them and whether they're compliant. So those kind of opportunities are really clear opportunities for lawyers to be learning a lot about this issue and for pro bono to be a real training opportunity for lawyers because it's becoming increasingly a really important skill for lawyers to have. In terms of corporate counsel, so with Trust Law, some of our global corporate counsel teams are the biggest champions of pro bono for us. They're really active in this, and we often partner law firms with corporate counsel teams on pro bono projects. I think what Anthony just said about corporate awareness of business and human rights principles being ahead of law firms in many cases, this is another opportunity where partnering with corporate counsel clients can also be a really great learning opportunity. Usually the corporate counsel teams that may be ahead of the game there.
So the issue with law firms undertaking pro bono work in this space can often throw up tensions between some of our commercial work. Anthony, just as a lawyer, I'd be interested in your views as to how firms are managing these tensions between the pro bono work that they're doing in certain areas and then also some of their client advice that they're giving.
Sure. So I think in terms of conflicts of interest, you always need to distinguish between a legal conflict of interest and a commercial conflict of interest. And so certainly Herbert Smith Freehills, and indeed I think any major international law firm these days, when a request for pro bono assistance is received, that goes into the same process to check conflicts of interest as any other instruction from any other client. And that will be to identify potential legal conflicts. You can't act against another client if you're holding confidential information, etc. It's simple, and those decisions are generally straightforward. easy to make. Where it becomes more difficult is where there's there could be a commercial conflict. So an NGO which has been advocating against the interests of one of the firm's clients, not always a legal conflict, a commercial conflict, and a decision has to be made about whether to take that work on. Those ones are difficult. And I think as a result, there will always be some work that international law firms in particular will find difficult to take on. But certainly in my career, I have worked with all of the major international human rights NGOs pro bono. Sometimes if there have been a request that is, you can always find a law firm ultimately, but you sort of go through that process. The other area which I think becomes, again, that this throws up is also the question of the risk to the firm's reputation based on the work it gets involved in. And this is an issue in terms of thinking about which corporate clients to work for, but also which pro bono clients to work for. And one of the things that I guess the clearinghouses help and do for us is do some of that vetting into the groups and NGOs and others, so that the firms don't have to do that work, but firms also have to look at it and think about, do we agree with what this work is, what the goal of this work is and what's trying to be achieved? And that can be this conflict of a campaign against a particular sector or against a particular client, which is difficult. It creates a threat to the business, and the partners in a law firm have fiduciary responsibilities similar to company directors. They can't just make decisions that are going to destroy the business. So there's that consideration as well. But then I also think there's increasingly a consideration of where can you make the most impact, where can you add the most value, and that may be in taking a discrete part of a project, not doing all of it. And this is where I think the partnering with corporates is very useful, and the things that the firm can do. Lawyers like to think they can do everything, but actually there are some things that they are not very good at. And so that's something that I think now we'll have to become more sophisticated about, how we decide which projects to take on. And also, I think the question of competence. As a litigation lawyer, I wouldn't agree to advise a company on how to list on the Australian Stock Exchange. I think equally lawyers have to think carefully when a request for pro bono assistance comes in as to whether they actually have the knowledge and the expertise to do that work. And some of the human rights related pro bono requests that come in, they actually require you to know an awful lot about international human rights law. And so I advise clients on international human rights, but I don't hold myself out as an expert. There'll be a point where I see a question and I think, we're going to go and find a professor or somebody else who is a subject matter expert. And corporate law firms are not going to start having huge departments of human rights specialists who know this stuff in real detail. So you often have to be looking around for a partner who can bring that niche area of expertise.
So, Bobby and Andy, I'd just like to bring you in here. You've heard both from clearinghouses and law firms about using pro bono initiatives. One of the things that we're increasingly seeing in Asia is the role of firms taking on pro bono litigation, to challenge companies and their actions in certain countries. From the NGO's perspective, do you have some concerns around the way in which corporate firms are engaging in strategic litigation like that? And if you do have concerns, how might firms better engage and run that litigation?
Yeah, I think an important issue that arises when law firms take on human rights cases to represent communities or aggrieved individuals is there really enough appreciation of the difference between representing a paying client on a non-human rights case and representing a non-paying client on a human rights case? Because often we are dealing with communities, with big groups, and not just individuals. And even if it's a case that involves one worker or a discrimination case that involves one woman, the outcome and how it is handled usually affects the other people in the same class. So I think one thing is to try to really understand what the impact of a certain course of action would be, not just on the individual, but on the movement. And while, of course, the responsibility is towards the client and not necessarily towards the movement, just making the clients aware of the impacts a certain course of action will have, not just on herself or himself, but also on other people in the same class. And another issue that arises is the accessibility of the lawyer to the local communities. Often there is that physical distance, there is that language barrier. Are they working through an intermediary INGO or another NGO, which brings into the picture a lot more relationships than a simple, straightforward attorney-client relationship? And this is, I think one way to view it would be to see pro bono engagement as becoming part of a team of experts that involves campaigners, that involves communicators, involves the victims and survivors themselves, and seeing themselves as the legal experts, but not the experts on everything else, which like bringing everything into context and just understanding long-term impacts and impacts beyond the clients themselves.
So I guess it's about international coalitions and organisations supporting those types of actions. Andy, was there anything you wanted to add?
Ya, yang saya pahami soal misalnya kerjasama antara LSM dengan pengacara private dari law firm, mungkin itu adalah pertukaran pengetahuan, pertukaran keahlian misalnya. Jadi atau yang pernah berlaku waktu itu adalah ketika teman-teman di Sumatera Barat itu pernah menggugat bank di Jepang. Jadi teman-teman LSM di Indonesia karena ada pendanaan pembangunan dam di Sumatera Barat, itu menggugatnya ke Jepang karena Jepang adalah pendananya. Nah, waktu itu kolaborasinya adalah pengacara LSM yang di Indonesia itu bekerja sama dengan lawyer-lawyer dari lawyer private, lawyer law firm besar yang ada di Jepang, dan mereka bekerja sama untuk dalam satu surat kuasa. Misalnya satu penanganan kasus seperti itu. Yang saya bayangkan juga misalnya kerjasama antara private law firm dengan pengacara-pengacara di LSM itu salah satunya juga adalah ketika andaikan pengacara dari perusahaan ini dia bisa mau membuka komunikasi dengan LSM. Dia mau bisa engage dengan teman-teman LSM. Andaikan ada satu kasus di satu daerah. Ini penting karena misalkan saja satu perusahaan perkebunan kelapa sawit membuka lahan di Kalimantan Barat. Nah, ketika dia belum melakukan pembukaan lahan, baik orang humas dari perusahaan maupun kuasa hukum atau lawyer yang merupakan lawyer yang merupakan kliennya dari perusahaan ini, itu bisa bertemu atau bertatap muka dulu dengan NGO. Itu yang saya bayangkan. Tapi ke depan memang kolaborasi antara lawyer dari NGO dengan private lawyer itu sangat dibutuhkan. Misalkan saja kasus di Jepang tadi, dan kedua misalnya ada kasus yang Elsam kami tangani misalnya, karena kasusnya itu adalah di Indonesia, tapi perusahaan yang diduga melakukan pelanggaran HAM ini berasal dari Swiss. Ya, kami mau tidak mau sempat bekerja sama dengan pengacara-pengacara atau ahli-ahli hukum yang ada dari Swiss. Kami waktu itu melakukan pengaduan dengan mekanisme National Contact Point di bawah OECD. Jadi memang kolaborasi pengacara LSM dengan private lawyer itu tidak harus ada. Kira-kira itu. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'm aware that this session has been cut significantly short just because of the last session ran over. So I did just want to open it up to anyone else who'd like to ask questions from the floor before I continue further questions.
Somebody says that the governments are developing national action plans. I was just wondering, while developing the national plan, action plan, whether that recognizes the diverse group that are disproportionately affected by the company's activities. For an example, in my countries, those development activities severely impact to the indigenous communities who are often voiceless. But when we talked about as only the vulnerable group, often they're left out, though they are invisible. So even if you looked about the guiding principles, I found that that is one of the lacuna. So whether these things has been addressed in any countries in the National Action Plan? Thank you.
Pasti di negara masing-masing itu punya berbagai kebijakan-kebijakan atau undang-undang yang satu sama lain terkadang itu tumpang tindih maupun berlainan ya. Nah, dengan adanya National Action Plan, pertimbangan-pertimbangan soal sinkronisasi peraturan, kemudian ada item-item yang harus menjadi perhatian khusus dalam pembangunan bisnis ke depan, itu yang harus dibereskan dulu oleh National Action Plan. Jadi National Action Plan ini bukan barang yang kaku. Jadi ketika dia sudah disahkan itu tidak mungkin dirubah, itu bukan seperti itu. Dia harus dikaji secara reguler, setahun, 2 tahun, itu tergantung kebutuhan. Nah, jadi dari National Action Plan itu akan terlihat apa yang harus dilakukan oleh pemerintah, apa yang harus dilakukan oleh unit bisnis, apa yang harus dilakukan mungkin oleh masyarakat secara umum. Mungkin yang bisa jadi rujukan kalau misalnya salah satunya penyusunan yang Komnas HAM di Indonesia lakukan itu, kita merujuk ke National Action Plan-nya Belanda. Karena agak lebih komprehensif, di sana diatur apa yang harus dilakukan dan tidak boleh dilakukan oleh perusahaan misalnya. Kemudian pemerintah melakukan apa, itu ada dalam National Action Plan. Kalau kita bandingkan dari sekarang sudah ada 10 negara yang sudah memiliki National Action Plan, itu tidak semua mengatur secara komprehensif memang. Misalnya mungkin ada yang sudah pernah lihat National Action Plan-nya UK itu sangat sedikit misalnya. Dan dia hanya mengatur sangat-sangat umum dari apa yang harus dilakukan unit bisnis. Tapi yang diharapkan dari United Nations Guiding Principle, NAP itu memang harus mengatur sampai kepada apa yang harus dan tidak boleh dilakukan oleh masing-masing pihak. Mungkin itu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Silakan yang lain nambahkan.
Were there any other? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just make one observation on that issue as well. And I think when you start to have a discussion about business and human rights, and actually the label is unfortunate, business and human rights, because the discussion becomes all about corporations and the activities of corporations. But a full third of the guiding principles talks about the existing international legal obligations of governments under international human rights treaties, including the human rights treaties dealing with Indigenous rights. And what has happened at the UN since the UN Guiding Principles were adopted, there has been some investment in implementation of the UN Guiding Principles, but if you were to measure the investment at the UN at the intergovernmental level, and even the investment of national governments in terms of national action plans. A lot of those national action plans have been produced on a shoestring. They've been done by national human rights institutions or by academic institutions. If you compare that actually to what corporations are investing in their human rights policies and in due diligence and impact assessment, that's where everything is happening. But unfortunately, what it means is we ignore the other issue, which is, are governments doing the right thing? Are they implementing their obligations? And one of the obligations is very interesting. under both the ICCPR and the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, there is an obligation of governments to progressively legislate. So the human rights standards are not static. The government has to be constantly trying to improve. And this is something that the Human Rights Committee looks at. And governments actually, this is one thing that's quite positive in the wake of the guiding principles, is the Human Rights Committee starting to say to governments, what are you doing to implement the UN guiding principles? And what the Human Rights Committee is saying is a national action plan is not enough. You will need to have laws and regulations and looking at your policies around enforcement of your laws and regulations to ensure that you are protecting human rights. And that's happened in the case of Germany, in the case of Canada, and there's a question now that's going in most of the Universal Periodic Review processes about what governments are doing to improve the situation vis-a-vis business-related human rights abuses. But governments have to be held accountable to those standards as well. This is not just a question about the activities of corporations. And in some cases, governments failing to discharge their obligations makes it impossible for certain businesses to operate in certain jurisdictions. So what the result you have is that responsible companies with human rights policies and who will do the right thing aren't the businesses that are operating in those jurisdictions or those places. The companies with the risk appetite and the willingness to do things in a way that has an adverse impact on human rights are not companies listed on the London Stock Exchange for the most part. And I see it in Indonesia all the time. The companies operating to low standards are not Western European companies. And that's a problem about implementation of the law. And it's got to be fixed by governments taking some action about regulation and enforcement of regulation.
Just on that point, when you're talking about national action plans and the fact they are absolutely done on a shoestring, John Ruggie recently said that one of the roles that lawyers can actually play in the development of the national action plans is undertaking that gap analysis, and that can be a really helpful way to just try and get some of those issues off the ground, and certainly that's one of the projects, pro bono projects, that our Australian lawyers have undertaken to try and support the Commonwealth Government and some of the NGOs that are engaging in those dialogues around a national action plan in Australia. I think we've got time for one more question if someone...
About how far should commercial lawyers go to proactively advise their clients on certain issues? Something I came across recently was a bunch of lawyers did a pro bono project for us. And there was some discussion over whether they should apply some of the learning from that project to their own work with their paying clients. And there appeared to be a wall which said you could not do that. Now, how do you unlearn something that you have learned while doing a pro bono project such that you cannot proactively add value to advice you're giving to your client by telling them about what you've learned doing your pro bono work? Just curious about how that works. Thanks.
That's a really good question, but that issue also is not confined to, or that problem or that dilemma in a law firm is not confined to the area of human rights. So, and the trajectory, and if you talk to lawyers who these days have busy anti-corruption practices, they will tell you about the history of their career where 20 years ago they were saying to their clients, you need to have a policy about bribery and corruption, you need to stop making these payments to government officials. And they just kept at it. And that's what is happening in this area as well. And so the lawyers I know internationally who have business and human rights practices, they just keep saying it until somebody listens. And if the clients don't want the advice and they're not prepared to pay for it and they tell you they don't want it, they don't want it. And in the extreme scenario where you genuinely think the client is doing the wrong thing or is walking into a situation where they're going to have some huge risk, it's your professional responsibility as a lawyer to give them the advice in most jurisdictions. And this is something that the IBA has found challenging in the debate about the lawyer's responsibilities, is different legal cultures have a different view about that question. When you see something that's strictly outside the scope of your mandate or your retainer. It's not the question you're asked to advise on. Do you have an obligation to say something? My view, personally, yes, you do. You should say it. And if you don't, it's a risk for you, it's a risk for the client, it's a risk for the firm. But that's not a universally accepted view. But where so the language you see in the IBA guidance that's been released is, recognises that tension. But I think certainly the international firms start to see this both as a key area of risk for their clients. So you have to tell the client, you have to say you are taking a risk. And then equally, it's a risk to the firm if you don't give that advice. One of the things I find when I do the training with younger lawyers is sometimes lawyers forget who the client is. In a corporate law firm, the client is the corporation. The client is not the individuals giving you the instruction, the general counsel who has a budgetary constraint and says, I want a discount on the invoice, I'm not going to pay for that advice. That's not the client. The client is the corporation. And the long-term interests of the corporation are something very different from the interests of the individuals who are trying to get a deal done, or trying to resolve a dispute, or trying to save their own reputations because they've messed something up. And that's something that I think, as I say, it's not confined to the area of human rights. It's an ethical issue for law firms to make sure that lawyers are thinking, hang on a minute, the client's the corporation. Do I have an obligation to give advice that's in the best interests of the corporation, as opposed to only answering the narrow questions that I'm being asked or executing the tasks that I'm being told to execute by the person giving me the instructions? And that's hugely challenging. And at the end of the day, those dilemmas require people to sit down and reflect on the ethics of the situation. And they don't. Each case will have to be assessed on its based on the individual circumstances. But I think that one of the most important things is for lawyers to remember who the client is. It's not the sceptical individuals who don't care about, the slavery issues that you're trying to raise or the money laundering issue you're trying to raise. It's the corporation.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap it up there. The panellists will be here if you'd like to ask them a few more questions, but if you can join me in thanking them for their time today.